The horizon bled crimson into the Arizona sky as the sun made its slow descent behind the distant mountains. Dust clouds swirled across the barren landscape, catching the day's dying light like spirits dancing over the cracked earth. A lone rider pursued a desperate man across this desolate canvas, two silhouettes against the vast emptiness. Mason Hawthorne's face remained impassive beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, the color of winter sky, never wavered from his quarry, a thief who had stolen more than money from the Prescott Bank. The man had taken something people in these parts valued more than gold: trust. Mason's black stallion, Midnight, moved with practiced precision, powerful muscles responding to the slightest pressure of his rider's knees. 4 days of tracking had led to this moment. There would be no escape. The thief's horse stumbled on loose shale, its exhausted legs finally giving out. The man tumbled forward, rolling in the dirt before scrambling to his feet, gun already drawn. Mason was faster. His shot echoed across the valley, finding the thief's leg with unerring accuracy. The man collapsed, clutching his bleeding thigh, his face contorted with pain and fear as Mason approached. "Please," he begged. "I got family." Mason dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. "So did the teller you shot." His voice carried no emotion, just the flat certainty of judgment. "He lived, which is why you're still breathing." With practiced efficiency, Mason bound the thief's hands and hoisted him onto his horse. Only then did he allow himself a moment to survey the landscape, watching as the day's final light surrendered to the approaching night. "Last job," Mason whispered to himself, the words carried away by the wind. "I'm done after this." 4 days later, Mason rode into Flagstaff alone, his prisoner delivered to the county jail in Williams with the bounty collected. The weight of the money pouch at his hip should have felt satisfying, enough to see him through the winter, but an unfamiliar emptiness had taken residence in his chest. At the hotel, Mason washed away days of trail dust and changed into clean clothes. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he pulled a weathered leather journal from his saddlebag. The ledger contained names, dates, amounts, some crossed out, others circled. His finger traced down to the final entry, circled twice. Tucker, Dry Creek Valley, 500 plus promise. Mason closed his eyes, memory taking him back 4 years. A blizzard had caught him unaware in the mountains, rare for a man who read nature's signs as easily as most read books. His horse dead, his leg broken, he had crawled through snow so deep it swallowed the world. Joshua Tucker had found him, half frozen and delirious, and dragged him back to life. For 6 weeks, Tucker had sheltered him, fed him, helped him heal. When spring finally came and Mason prepared to leave, Tucker had asked for a loan, $500 to save his struggling ranch from foreclosure. "I swear on my life, Hawthorne," Tucker had said, his hand gripping Mason's with desperate strength, "I'll pay you back before the year's end." Mason had given him the money without hesitation. It wasn't just about the debt, it was the promise. The sacred word between men that still meant something in these territories. But the money never came. No letter, no message. 2 years ago, Mason had heard rumors that Joshua Tucker had died in a mining accident. Now it was time to see for himself, to look upon Tucker's grave and settle accounts with whatever remained. Dawn broke over Dry Creek Valley 3 days later as Mason guided Midnight down the dusty trail that led to what had once been the Tucker homestead. The early November air carried a sharp bite, warning of the winter to come. Mason pulled his coat tighter and studied the land. The valley stretched before him, caught between the promise of life and the certainty of death. Dry grasses bent in submission to the wind, whispering secrets to fence posts warped by years of sun and neglect. In the distance, the silhouette of a small ranch stood in defiance of the desolation surrounding it. Every board of the old Tucker homestead leaned as if in prayer, waiting for either a miracle or a merciful end. The barn listed dangerously to one side, and what passed for a chicken coop was little more than a collection of salvaged planks held together by hope and rusty nails. As Mason approached, he heard the sound that always seemed out of place in such hardship: children's laughter. A boy's voice called out, followed by a girl's response, their words indistinct, but their joy unmistakable. Then came another voice, a woman's, calm, tired, commanding. Mason slowed Midnight at what passed for a gate, a limp rope strung between two leaning posts. Beyond it, a chicken scratched at the earth, unbothered by his presence. Mason dismounted, his boots meeting the ground with a hollow sound that seemed to announce his arrival more than any words could. From behind the side of the barn emerged a woman carrying a basket of damp laundry. She was young, younger than he had expected, perhaps 28, with sun-browned skin and a lean frame that spoke of hard work and too little food. Her dark hair was tied back without care, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her apron bore the stains of the morning's work. What struck Mason most were her eyes, a deep amber that held something fierce and unbroken despite the weight clearly pressing down on her slender shoulders. She saw him and didn't falter in her stride. "You're Hawthorne," she said, her voice neither welcoming nor hostile, simply stating a fact. Mason nodded once. "I am." She set the basket down and wiped her palms on the sides of her skirt. "You've come about Joshua's debt." It wasn't a question, and Mason didn't treat it as one. "I've come for what's owed." Silence stretched between them, taut as barbed wire. A cold breeze lifted the corner of a sheet hanging from the line, making it snap like a flag of surrender. "My husband owed you," she said, her gaze unwavering. "That's not something I pretend doesn't exist." "The debt's been carried longer than most grief," Mason replied, his tone neutral. "You want the deed to this land?" Her expression remained unreadable. "Come see what you're claiming." She turned without waiting for his response, and Mason followed her through the gate. The porch creaked beneath their steps, the sound of surrender in old wood. Two children peeked from behind a tattered curtain, a girl with braided hair and a smaller boy with curious eyes. A third child, no more than 5, clung to the woman's skirt. She didn't shoo them away. "I'm Sarah Tucker," she said as they stood on the porch. "These are some of my children. The other 2 are collecting eggs." Mason looked at the children, then back at Sarah. The children shared no obvious resemblance to her or to each other. Different coloring, different features. "How long until the first frost?" Sarah asked, not looking at him. 8 days, maybe 10. "I need 7, she said. 7? 7 days to finish the harvest, to jar what's left of the beans, to fix the south window so Emma doesn't freeze in her sleep." She turned to face him, calm as a drawn bow. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for 7 days." Mason studied her face. The lines around her mouth were not from smiling. Her hands were cracked, knuckles red. She had the look of someone who had wrestled the land and lost more than once but kept wrestling anyway. "Why not leave?" Tony asked. "Sell what's left. Go east. Life's easier there." Sarah glanced at the children, then back to Mason. "They were born here," she said simply, "even the ones that weren't." Mason said nothing. The wind whipped at his coat, bringing with it the scent of coming rain and distant wood smoke. "They're not yours by birth," he observed, the pieces falling into place. "These children." Sarah's jaw tightened. "They're mine in every way that matters. 3 belonged to Joshua's sister and her husband. They died in the fever outbreak 2 years back. The other 2 came from his cousin's family after a house fire." She lifted her chin slightly. "I cannot have children of my own, but I know how to love, and I never abandon family." Something in Mason's chest tightened at her words, an old wound he'd thought long scarred over. 7 days, he said finally, turning back toward his horse. At the saddle, he paused, then called over his shoulder, 7 days. We'll see what's left to claim after that." He mounted and rode away, the hoofbeats of his horse beating a slow, steady rhythm into the dust. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, promising rain that would likely never reach this thirsty land. Sarah Tucker stood on the porch, arms crossed tight across her chest, watching him disappear into the waning light. The sky behind him bled red into gray as the sun made its final retreat. 7 days it is," she whispered, more to herself than to the wind. Mason Hawthorne did not trust what his eyes saw. Years of tracking men who lived by deception had taught him that appearances rarely told the whole story. He had seen desperate people use every trick, tears, false dignity, children's sad eyes, to avoid paying what they owed. So he set up camp half a mile east of the Tucker homestead, just beyond a dry bend in the creek where cottonwoods grew tall and thick. From there, he could see the roof of the house through the trees, smell the smoke from the cooking fire, and hear the distant echoes of children's laughter. But he did not come close. Not yet. He watched, because he needed to know if Sarah Tucker was what she appeared or just another settler using sorrow as a shield. The first night at his camp, Mason sat before a small fire, his back against a cottonwood trunk. From his saddlebag, he removed a wooden box no larger than his palm. Inside lay a scrap of faded fabric, a handkerchief embroidered with wildflowers, the only possession he had of his mother's. She had died bringing him into the world, leaving him with nothing but this small token and a life spent in the cold halls of a Denver orphanage. Mason traced the stitching with a calloused finger, wondering not for the first time what she had been like, this woman whose face he would never know. Would she recognize the man he had become? Would she approve of a son who made his living hunting other men? The stars over the Arizona desert reminded him of nights in Denver, when 8-year-old Mason would sneak out onto the orphanage's roof to watch the night sky. Those stolen moments were rare tastes of freedom, away from the strict regimen and bone-deep chill of the old brick building. Mason closed his eyes, memories coming unbidden. The practiced smiles of couples who came to adopt, always choosing younger children, more malleable ones. The hand of Father Timothy, the orphanage director, gripping his shoulder. No one wants a boy too stubborn for his own good, Mason. If you don't learn to obey, you'll always be here. And so he was. By 12, Mason understood he would grow old within those walls unless he escaped them. On a winter night, he had fled with nothing but his mother's handkerchief and a burning hunger for freedom. Mason had survived, but the cost was hardness, learning not to trust, not to depend. You don't need a family, he would tell himself each night during those wandering years. You don't need anyone. Until he met old Sheriff Holbrook in Tucson, who saw potential in the wild teenager and taught him to track fugitives, Mason had found no purpose. But even Holbrook kept his distance. Never make it personal, kid, he often said. Never care too much. It'll kill you. Now, looking down at the valley where Sarah Tucker and 5 orphan children slept, Mason wondered if he was making his life's greatest mistake, starting to care, truly care, after all these years. He tucked the handkerchief away as the night deepened, but sleep evaded him. His mind kept returning to Sarah Tucker and her mismatched family, to the fierce protection in her eyes, to the way she spoke of children, born here, even the ones that weren't. In the orphanage, no one had ever looked at him that way, like he belonged, like he was worth fighting for. Dawn broke clear and cold. Mason saddled midnight and rode toward town, careful to remain unseen from the Tucker homestead. In Cedar Springs, he lingered at the general store, listening to gossip, asking careful questions about the Tucker family. Sad business that, the storekeeper said, shaking his head. Joshua wasn't much, drank too hard, gambled worse, but those youngsters deserve better than starving out there with winter coming. The woman seems capable, Mason observed. Sarah? Lord, yes, stubborn as they come. Won't take charity, works herself to the bone. Took in all those orphans when she didn't have to. Word is she can't have young'uns herself. The storekeeper leaned closer. Joshua weren't exactly gentle with her, if you catch my meaning. Many a night she showed up with bruises she thought nobody noticed. Mason's jaw tightened. He hit her? Not just hit, beat her proper sometimes, especially after the drink, but she stayed. For the children, folks say. The man straightened. Why the interest, stranger? Just passing through, Mason replied, placing coins on the counter for supplies. Heard about the mining accident. Knew Tucker some years back. Back at his camp, Mason watched the Tucker homestead through his spyglass. Sarah worked from dawn to dusk. She carried feed sacks across the yard, coughing behind her sleeve but never slowing. She mended fences with rusted nails, milked a goat that kept kicking her bucket over, swept the porch, hauled water, all with the determined silence of someone who knew no one was coming to help. The oldest boy, Daniel, Mason had learned, chopped wood with an axe too big for his 12-year-old frame. The oldest girl, Sophie, tended the younger children while also keeping the vegetable garden. Even the little ones had tasks, collecting eggs or carrying kindling. There was no laughter during work, no wasted movement, just the grim efficiency of people who understood that survival required every ounce of effort they could muster. One afternoon, Mason observed a different scene. A cart from the neighboring homestead had broken down on the trail passing the Tucker place. A wheel had shattered, its axle bent. An older woman stood beside it, helpless amid her scattered belongings. Without hesitation, Sarah called to her children, "Daniel, get the rope. Sophie, bring water. We're helping." They left their chores and jogged to the cart. Mason narrowed his eyes. Helping someone else, when you had nothing to spare, was either foolish or holy. He had never trusted either. He watched them push and pull and laugh through the mud as they worked to free the cart. When it finally lurched forward, Sarah handed the old woman a small basket, 5 eggs and a heel of bread. "Just until you're back on your feet," she said. Mason shook his head, muttering, "Damn foolish woman, giving away what she doesn't have." But something about the way she smiled, genuine, tired, unashamed, sat uncomfortably in his chest. That evening, voices drifted from the Tucker porch. Mason had settled behind a tree, pretending even to himself that he wasn't listening. But the wind carried every word. "That man riding by earlier," Daniel asked. "He the one who's come to take our home?" "Mr. Hawthorne is doing his job," Sarah's voice answered. "He's not here to be liked." "You ain't scared of him?" "No, man." A pause. "Men who keep their word don't scare me." Mason didn't breathe for a moment. He had come expecting curses, excuses, fear. Instead, she had met him at the gate and spoken plain. And now, when she could have painted him a villain to her children, she defended his purpose. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. The fire crackled beside him, but his bedroll remained cold. He sat up grumbling and scanned the land between his camp and the house. In the moonlight, he saw a small figure, the youngest girl, Emma, barefoot, chasing after an escaped chicken. Her tiny feet were bloodied from the sharp gravel, but still she laughed, arms flapping like wings as she mimicked the bird she pursued. Mason's jaw clenched. At first light, he rode into town and purchased a pair of children's boots from the general store. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. Before dawn the next morning, Mason approached the Tucker homestead silently. He placed the small boots, worn but sturdy, neatly on the porch steps. No note, no explanation. As he retreated to the tree line, he saw the door open. Sarah emerged, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. At first light, Sarah opened her door to find a pair of small boots resting neatly on the porch. Worn leather, but solid, clean. Her hand trembled as she picked them up. Later that morning, Mason watched from his hidden position as 8-year-old Ethan approached the well. The boy struggled with the heavy bucket, determination etched on his small face as he tried to prove his strength. When the rope slipped, nearly dropping the bucket back into the depths, Mason almost revealed himself to help. But before he could, Ethan recovered, his jaw set with a stubbornness that reminded Mason of himself at that age. "Someday I'll be strong enough to protect everyone," the boy muttered to himself, unaware of being observed. "Like Pa was supposed to." The words struck Mason. This middle child, quiet where Daniel was vocal, serious where Emma was playful, carried his own burden of responsibility. Too much for such young shoulders. The next day, when Sarah and the children returned from gathering firewood, they found a small wooden pulley system installed at the well, making the bucket easier to draw. Ethan studied it with keen interest, quickly figuring out how the simple machine worked. "Clever, Titium," Mason heard the boy say as he ran his fingers over the smooth wood. Really clever. That same morning, Mason found a small bundle outside his tent. Wrapped in faded blue cloth, still warm from the hearth, was a loaf of homemade bread, cracked on top and heavy with oats. No note, no explanation needed. He squatted beside his fire, unwrapped it, and inhaled the scent of simple sustenance made with care. Then he tore off a piece and chewed slowly. He didn't smile, but something in his chest, tight and long forgotten, shifted. She hadn't said thank you. She didn't have to. The days passed with their own rhythm. Mason continued his quiet observation, but something had changed. He found himself riding closer to the homestead, no longer hiding his presence. He nodded when Sarah looked up from her work, and she nodded back, a silent acknowledgement between them. On the 4th morning, Mason was repairing his saddle when he heard the thundering approach of horses. 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, dust clouds billowing behind them. Even at a distance, Mason recognized the type. Hard men with harder intentions. He grabbed his rifle and mounted Midnight, keeping to the tree line as he moved closer to the homestead. The riders circled the property once before approaching the house directly. Reyes brothers, Mason muttered, his hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. Even in the shadow distance, he recognized the distinctive silhouette of Victor Reyes, the eldest and most ruthless of the notorious outlaw family. 2 years earlier, Mason had tracked their youngest brother, Miguel, through 3 territories after a particularly brutal murder of a shopkeeper's family in Yuma. When Miguel had taken a schoolteacher hostage, Mason had been forced to make an impossible shot that wounded the outlaw, but allowed him to be captured alive. At the trial, Miguel had cursed Mason's name before the hangman's noose silenced him forever. The 3 remaining Reyes brothers, Victor, Luis, and Emilio, had sworn a blood oath on their brother's grave that Mason Hawthorne would die screaming. The wanted posters across Arizona territory warned of the brothers' penchant for torture before killing. They didn't just murder their targets, they destroyed them completely, often taking vengeance on family members first, while their enemies watched helplessly. Now, seeing them circle Sarah's property, Mason felt a cold dread he rarely experienced. These weren't common bandits looking for easy pickings. They were hunters who had somehow tracked him to this vulnerable place. But they weren't here for Mason. They couldn't know he was nearby. This was simply predators finding vulnerable prey. From his position, Mason watched Sarah emerge from the house, shotgun in hand. She stood on the porch, children behind her, as the riders approached. "Morning, ma'am," the oldest Reyes called, a mock politeness in his voice. "Seems you might be in need of protection out here, all alone with these little ones." "We manage just fine," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the yard. "Please move along." "Now that ain't neighborly," another brother said, dismounting. "Heard tell your man died owing money all over. Thought we might help ourselves to a few head of cattle, even things out." "We have no cattle," Sarah said, raising the shotgun slightly, "and no outstanding debts except one, which is being settled properly." The third brother laughed. "That old scattergun even work, missus. Looks like it might blow up in your pretty face." Mason had heard enough. He urged Midnight forward, emerging from the trees into the open yard. "The lady asked you to move along," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made grown men surrender without a fight. The Reyes brothers turned, hands instinctively moving to their holsters. Recognition dawned on the oldest one's face. "Hawthorne," he spat. "Didn't expect to find you out here." "Life's full of surprises," Mason replied evenly. "This property and these people are under my protection. I suggest you find easier pickings elsewhere." The brothers exchanged glances, clearly calculating the odds. Mason Hawthorne's reputation preceded him. 15 years as a bounty hunter, with more successful captures than any 3 marshals combined. "This ain't over, Hawthorne," the oldest Reyes growled. "We owe you for our brother." "You're welcome to try collecting," Mason said. "But not here, not today." A tense moment passed before the brothers remounted. "We'll be seeing you," the leader promised as they rode away, dust swirling in their wake. "Well, well," Victor Reyes drawled, his weathered face creasing into a cruel smile. "If it isn't the famous Mason Hawthorne, we've been looking for you for a long time." "Not here, Reyes," Mason warned. "Your quarrel is with me, not these people." Victor's dark eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Mason. "Interesting," he said softly. "The great bounty hunter has found himself a woman." His gaze shifted to the children watching fearfully from the doorway. "And little ones, too. How convenient." Luis Reyes spat on the ground. "Miguel screamed for mercy before they hanged him, Hawthorne. Our mother went blind from crying over his body." "Your brother murdered a child," Mason replied evenly. "He chose his path." "And now we choose yours," Emilio, the youngest of the 3, added with a malevolent grin. "We were just passing through, but now we have a reason to stay in this charming valley." Victor nudged his horse forward slightly. "We'll go for now. But remember this, widow woman." He tipped his hat mockingly toward Sarah. "When you find yourself alone in the dark, wondering where your protector is, we'll be watching. And Hawthorns don't die quick in Rhea's hands." When they were gone, Mason turned to Sarah. Her face was pale, but her hands on the shotgun were steady. "Would that have fired?" he asked, nodding at the ancient weapon. Once, maybe, she admitted, before it fell apart or killed me. Their eyes met, and for the first time since his arrival, Sarah Tucker smiled. A small, tired thing, but genuine. Thank you, she said simply. Mason nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. They'll be back, with more men. Why did you help us? Sarah asked, lowering the shotgun. You're here to take this place. Mason looked past her to the children, huddled in the doorway, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Emma clutched her new boots to her chest like a treasure. I haven't decided what I'm here to do yet, he answered honestly. That night, as Mason made his rounds of the property before retiring, he noticed something hanging from the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. Drawing closer, rifle ready, he discovered a crudely carved wooden doll, its neck wrapped in twine to simulate hanging. A small piece of paper had been nailed to the doll's chest, bearing just 3 words, "Watching you both." Mason quickly removed the grim warning before Sarah or the children could see it. But the message was clear. The Reyes brothers weren't simply making idle threats. They were studying the homestead, learning routines, planning something methodical. Their patience made them far more dangerous than common bandits who would attack impulsively. For the first time in years, Mason found himself checking his weapons compulsively, starting at small sounds in the night, not for his own safety, but for Sarah's, for the children's. Having people to protect created vulnerabilities he'd never had to consider during his years as a lone bounty hunter. The next morning, Daniel found horseshoe prints by the well. Someone had been close enough to the house during the night to draw water. And when Sarah went to gather eggs, she found a chicken with its neck wrung, carefully placed in the nesting box like a warning. We should tell the sheriff, Sarah suggested, her voice steady despite the fear Mason could see in her eyes. Collins can't stop men like the Reyes brothers, Mason replied grimly. They're too smart, too patient. They'll wait until he's gone, then strike. Then what do we do? She asked. Mason looked toward the distant mountains where he knew the outlaws were watching. We prepare, and I teach you all how to protect yourselves if I'm not here. That afternoon, Daniel approached Mason as he repaired a loose board on the barn. The boy stood awkwardly, a man's determination in a child's frame. I heard what Mr. Peterson said in town, he said abruptly, about you being a bounty hunter. Mason continued working, hammering a nail with practiced precision. I was. You killed people? When there was no other choice. Daniel absorbed this. My father said men who hunt other men have no souls. Mason paused, looking at the boy directly. Your father said a lot of things, I imagine. Some true, some not. He hit my mother, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper. When he drank, said it was her fault she couldn't give him real children of his own. Mason's grip tightened on the hammer. A man who hits women isn't fit to judge anyone's soul. Are you going to take our home? The question came straight and honest, with no attempt at manipulation. Mason returned to his work. 7 days aren't up yet. If you do, Daniel continued, will you at least make sure we stay together? The 5 of us. Nobody wants all 5, but Mom promised we'd never be separated. The hammer stilled mid-strike. Mason looked at the earnest young face before him, saw the fear beneath the brave facade, and something inside him, something he thought long dead, stirred painfully. Go help your mother, he said gruffly. This barn won't fix itself. That night, Mason sat alone by his fire, the ledger open on his knee. Joshua Tucker's debt stared back at him, 500 plus interest. More than this hardscrabble farm was worth, certainly more than Sarah Tucker could ever pay. He thought of the 5 children, of Sarah working from dawn to dusk, of the fierceness with which she protected what was hers, even the ones that weren't. He thought of Daniel's request and the terror of separation that haunted orphan children, a terror Mason knew all too well. From his pocket, he withdrew a folded paper, a letter Joshua had written before Mason left his home 4 years ago. He had read it so many times the creases were worn thin, but tonight the words seemed to carry new meaning. Hawthorne, when you find this, you'll be gone from my home. The money you lent will save my land, and for that, I thank you. I swear on my life I'll repay every cent before the snow flies. A man's word is all he truly owns in this world, and I give you mine. You saved more than just yourself when you crawled through that blizzard to my door. You reminded me that even in this harsh country, there's still goodness to be found. Perhaps someday I can do the same for another soul in need. Until we meet again, Joshua Tucker Mason folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. The man who wrote those words and the man who beat his wife couldn't possibly be the same person. Yet they were human contradiction in its purest form. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Mason from his thoughts. He looked up to find Sarah Tucker standing at the edge of his camp, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against the night chill. "May I join you?" she asked. Mason nodded, gesturing to a log across the fire. She sat, her face half in shadow, half illuminated by the dancing flames. "I saw you talking with Daniel today," she said after a moment of silence. "Good boy. Carries too much weight for his age." Sarah studied the fire. "They all do." More silence, but not uncomfortable. The crackling of the flames filled the space between them. "Why did Joshua never repay you?" Sarah finally asked. "The truth, please." Mason considered the question. "I don't know. I never heard from him after I left." "He told me about you," Sarah said. "Said a stranger nearly dead from cold crawled to our door 4 winters back. Said he nursed you to health, and you gave him money out of gratitude." Mason's eyes narrowed. "That's not exactly how it happened." "I figured as much." Sarah's gaze was direct, unflinching. "Joshua lied as easily as breathing." "Then why ask me?" "Because I need to know what kind of man you are," she replied, "before I ask what I came to ask." Mason waited, saying nothing. Sarah took a deep breath. "I want to make a deal. I can't pay you $500. Not now, maybe not ever. But I can work. I can send you a portion of whatever we earn from the crops each season." Her voice remained steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. "Just don't separate us. Don't take the children's home." The firelight caught the unshed tears in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to use them as currency. Mason looked at her, really looked at her. In the dancing light, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her face open and vulnerable, Sarah Tucker was beautiful in the way only true things can be, weathered and worn, but genuine to her core. "Why did you stay with him?" Mason asked quietly. "When he hurt you?" Sarah's face registered surprise, then resignation. "You've been asking about us in town." Mason nodded. "I stayed because leaving meant abandoning the children to him," she said simply. "And I couldn't do that." "Even though they weren't yours?" Her eyes flashed. "They've been mine from the moment they had no one else. Blood doesn't make family, Mr. Hawthorne. Love does. Choice does." The words struck Mason with unexpected force. In the orphanage, he had been taught that family was something other people had, something he had been denied by accident of birth and death. Never had he considered it might be something created through choice and sustained through will. Sarah rose to her feet, drawing her shawl tighter. "You have 2 days left to decide. I hope you'll consider my offer." She turned to leave, but Mason's voice stopped her. "Joshua didn't nurse me back to health," he said. "He found me half dead in the snow, yes, but then he put a gun to my head and demanded whatever money I carried." Mason's tone remained neutral, stating facts without judgment. "I had nothing. He was going to leave me there. But a blizzard blew in, too dangerous to travel, so he dragged me back to his cabin, figuring a half-dead bounty hunter might be worth something come spring." Sarah had gone very still, her back to Mason. "For 6 weeks, I lay in his house, healing from frostbite and a broken leg. He fed me because a dead man pays no debts. When I could walk again, he told me about the bank coming for his land." Mason paused. "I gave him the money because I believed his story about a family needing a home. He swore he'd repay me by winter. Said a man's word was all he truly owned." Sarah turned slowly, her face a mask of grief and shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mason shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. He was not a good man," she said, her voice barely audible. "When he died, God forgive me, but part of me felt free." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. "There's no sin in truth," Mason said, quietly. Sarah nodded once and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Mason alone with the fire in his thoughts. The 6th day dawned with the threat of early snow. Gray clouds hung low over the mountains, and the wind carried the first true bite of winter. Mason rode into town early, his decision made during the long, sleepless night. In the dusty law office of Cedar Springs, he filed paperwork transferring Joshua Tucker's debt to the account of Mason Hawthorne. effectively canceling it. Then he visited the bank, making arrangements that took nearly an hour to complete. When he returned to the homestead of Hinnipan, he found Sarah and the children frantically harvesting the last of their garden, racing the coming weather. "Storm's moving fast," he called as he dismounted. "Get everything you can inside." Together they worked through the afternoon, Mason hauling root vegetables, Sarah directing the children, everyone's hands moving with purpose. When the first snowflakes began to fall, they had managed to save most of the remaining crop. In the warmth of the kitchen, Sarah handed Mason a cup of hot coffee. The children watched him with curious eyes, no longer afraid but not quite trusting. "Thank you for your help today," Sarah said, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. Mason set his cup down and reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. He placed it on the table between them. "What's this?" Sarah asked, not touching it. "The deed to this property," Mason replied. "Cleared of all debts." Sarah stared at him, disbelief etched across her features. "I don't understand." "The debt is settled," Mason said simply. "How?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "We have nothing to give you." Mason's eyes moved to the children, then back to Sarah. "Some debts can't be measured in dollars, Mrs. Tucker." Before she could respond, hoofbeats thundered in the yard outside. Daniel rushed to the window, his face draining of color. "It's them," he said. "The men from yesterday. More of them." Mason was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Outside, at least 6 riders circled the house, the Reyes brothers at the lead. "Stay inside," he ordered, checking his gun. "All of you." As he stepped onto the porch, snow swirling around him, Mason Hawthorne knew the 7 days were up, but the reckoning had only just begun. The Reyes brothers halted their horses in a semicircle before the porch, snow dusting their shoulders and the brims of their hats. Behind them, 4 more men sat astride nervous mounts, hands resting on holstered weapons. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air, mingling with the steam rising from their horses' nostrils. Mason stood tall on the weathered porch, one hand resting casually near his holster. His face betrayed nothing, not fear, not anger, just the patient calculation of a man who had faced death too many times to be hurried by its approach. "Twice in 2 days, Reyes," Mason called out. "Must be important." Victor Reyes, the oldest brother, spat into the dirt. "You killed our brother, Hawthorne." "Your brother killed 3 people, including a child," Mason replied evenly. "The law hanged him. I just brought him to it." "Law," Victor sneered. "Out here, we make our own justice." Mason's gaze swept over the assembled men, assessing each one with a bounty hunter's practiced eye. 2 were hired guns, professionals who wouldn't take unnecessary risks. The others were local troublemakers, dangerous only in numbers and likely to break if the odds turned. "This isn't your land, Reyes," Mason said. "These people have no quarrel with you." "But you do," the second brother, Luis, cut in. "And you seem mighty concerned with this place. Makes me wonder why a man like you would care about a widow and some orphans." His smile revealed a gold tooth. "Unless there's something here worth protecting." Behind Mason, the door creaked open. Sarah stepped out, shotgun in hand, her presence both defiance and vulnerability. "Go back inside," Mason said without turning. "This is my home," Sarah replied quietly. "I won't hide in it." Mason wanted to argue but recognized the steel in her voice. Instead, he shifted slightly, positioning himself between her and the riders. "One chance," Mason announced to the Reyes gang. "Ride away now. Come for me another day, another place." Victor Reyes laughed, the sound sharp in the cold air. "You think you're walking away from this, Hawthorne? 7 against 1. 7 against 2, Sarah corrected, raising the shotgun. "And just how many shells you got in that ancient scattergun, missus?" Louise taunted. "Enough," she replied simply. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft patter of snowflakes and the occasional snort of a horse. Mason could feel the weight of the moment, the invisible line being drawn that, once crossed, couldn't be undone. Victor Reyes's hand moved toward his gun. "Wait," Mason said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You want me, not them. These people have suffered enough." He stepped down from the porch into the yard, snow crunching beneath his boots. "I'll ride with you, Reyes, away from here. You get your chance at revenge without risking your men against a desperate woman protecting her children." Sarah made a small mound of protest behind him, but Mason didn't turn. Victor Reyes's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would you offer that? Because unlike your brother, I don't hide behind innocence, Mason answered. And because you're right about one thing, I do care what happens here. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than Mason had intended. The brothers exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years riding together. Finally, Victor nodded. Your horse, no weapons. You ride between us. His mouth twisted in a cold smile. Say your goodbyes, Hawthorne. They'll be your last. Mason turned to Sarah, whose face had gone pale with understanding. He kept his voice low, meant only for her. The storm will keep them from returning right away. Take the children to town as soon as we're gone. Mayor Collins will help you. I've made arrangements. They'll kill you, Sarah whispered fiercely. Maybe, Mason conceded, but they'll do it far from here. Her eyes searched his, looking for answers to questions she couldn't voice. Why are you doing this? Mason glanced at the house, where 5 small faces watched from the window. Because some debts can't be measured, he repeated softly. Before she could respond, he removed his gun belt and handed it to her. Keep this safe. Then, without another word, Mason walked to midnight, mounted, and rode toward the Reyes brothers. As they surrounded him, Victor roughly searched him for hidden weapons, finding only a small knife in his boot, which he confiscated with a sneer. No tricks, Hawthorne, he warned, or we'll come back and finish what we started. Mason said nothing, his eyes locked on Sarah standing alone on the porch, the snow falling more heavily around her slender frame. As the group turned their horses and began to ride away, he allowed himself one last look at the Tucker homestead, a broken place that somehow held more humanity than any fine house he'd ever known. The last thing he saw before the swirling snow obscured his vision was Daniel, the oldest boy, stepping out to stand beside his mother, his young face set in a determination beyond his years. They rode for hours through the worsening storm, heading into the foothills where the Reyes brothers had established their hideout. The wind howled between rocky outcroppings, driving snow into their faces and making conversation impossible. Mason used the time to study his captors, looking for weaknesses, calculating distances, marking landmarks despite the limited visibility. By the time they reached the crude cabin nestled against a cliff face, darkness had fallen completely. 2 more men emerged from the cabin, guns drawn, as the riders dismounted. Get him inside, Victor ordered, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Rough hands dragged Mason from his horse and shoved him through the doorway. The cabin interior was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace at one end, a few rickety bunks along the walls, and a table scarred by knife marks and spilled liquor. A fire burned low in the grate, offering minimal warmth and casting long shadows across the dirt floor. Mason was forced into a chair, his hands bound behind him with rawhide that bit into his wrists. Victor Reyes stood before him, removing his snow-covered hat and coat with deliberate slowness. 2 years we've been waiting for this moment, he said, warming his hands by the fire. 2 years since you brought our brother in for that bounty. Your brother made his choices, Mason replied evenly. Victor turned, his face a mask of controlled rage. He was 20 years old. Old enough to know better than to shoot a shopkeeper and his family. The punch came without warning, rocking Mason's head back. He tasted blood but didn't give Victor the satisfaction of a reaction. Luis Reyes stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his brother's arm. Not so fast, Victor. We've waited too long to rush this. He looked at Mason with something almost like respect. Hawthorne has a reputation. Best bounty hunter in 3 territories. Never lost a target. Until now, Victor growled. I'm curious, Luis continued, ignoring his brother. Why were you at that farm? Word was you'd retired, gone back east. Mason said nothing, his silence an impenetrable wall. The widow's pretty, the third brother, Emilio, chimed in from where he leaned against the doorframe. Maybe he found something worth staying for. The others laughed, the sound ugly in the confined space. That it, Hawthorne? Victor taunted. You sweet on Tucker's widow, taking up his debts and his woman? Mason's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a dangerous light that made Luis step back instinctively. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter now, Victor said, drawing his knife. By morning, you'll be begging us to kill you. And when we're done, then maybe we'll pay the widow another visit. See if she's as brave without her protector." Mason's muscles tensed against his bonds. "Touch her or those children, and there won't be a place on this earth you can hide." Victor laughed. Big words from a dead man. As the night wore on, the storm outside intensified, wind howling through cracks in the cabin walls like tortured spirits seeking entry. Inside, the Reyes brothers took turns with Mason, their cruelty betraying years of perfected torture techniques. "Our grandfather was an inquisitor in Mexico," Victor explained almost conversationally as he heated his knife blade in the fire. "He taught our father, who taught us, that pain is an art form. Too much too quickly, and the canvas dies before the masterpiece is complete." Mason's face was already swollen from Luis's methodical beating, but he remained silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing him plead. "Miguel talked about you, you know," Emilio said, his boyish face a disturbing contrast to the malice in his eyes. "During his last days in prison, he told us how you tracked him through Apache territory, how you waited 3 days without moving to get the perfect shot." The young outlaw leaned closer. "He admired you in a way, said you were a man of patience." "We're men of patience too," Victor continued, testing the glowing blade with a wetted finger that sizzled on contact. "We could have killed you a dozen times over the past week, but we watched instead. Learned about the widow, the children." A cruel smile twisted his face, "Especially the little one, Emma, with her new boots. She wanders too far from the house sometimes." At the mention of Emma's name, something shifted in Mason's eyes, a dangerous, cold fury that made even Victor pause momentarily. "Ah, there it is," the outlaw leader said softly. "The famous Hawthorne death stare. Miguel told us about that too. Said when your eyes went cold like that, someone was about to die." He brought the glowing blade closer to Mason's face. "But not tonight. Tonight, you're the one who'll wish for death before we're through." Through the pain that followed, Mason forced his mind elsewhere, not just to Sarah and the children, but to the subtle weaknesses he had observed in each brother. Victor's blind spot on his left side from an old injury, Luis's tendency to telegraph his movements before striking, young Emilio's nervousness whenever he was left alone to guard a prisoner. Mason had built his reputation not just on tracking abilities, but on seeing patterns others missed. And even as the torture continued, he was mapping his escape, calculating odds, waiting for the perfect moment, just as he had when tracking Miguel Reyes years ago. At some point, exhaustion overtook his tormentors. The fire burned down to embers, and most of the men collapsed into drunken sleep on the bunks or floor. Only Emilio remained awake, sitting by the door with a bottle and a rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Mason tested his bonds carefully, feeling the rawhide stretch slightly from his blood and sweat. His face was swollen, one eye nearly closed, but his mind remained clear. He had been in worse situations and lived. The key was patience, waiting for the perfect moment rather than the first opportunity. As Emilio's head began to nod, Mason worked methodically on the bindings. Years as a bounty hunter had taught him tricks that would-be outlaws never considered. The rawhide gave fractionally with each subtle movement, the pain in his abraded wrists a distant concern compared to the need for freedom. Hours passed. The storm began to abate, the howling wind gradually subsiding to a mournful moan. Dawn approached, evidenced by the faint gray light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. Soon the brothers would wake, and Mason's chance would be gone. With a final painful effort, he slipped one hand free. Moving with the silent precision that had made him legendary among lawmen and criminals alike, Mason rose from the chair. Emilio snored softly by the door, chin resting on his chest, the rifle loose in his grasp. Mason crossed the room in 3 steps, clamping one hand over Emilio's mouth while the other rested the rifle away. The young outlaw's eyes flew open in panicked confusion, but Mason's grip was iron. "Not a sound," he whispered, "or your brothers find you with your throat cut." Emilio nodded frantically. Mason dragged him outside into the pre-dawn dimness where the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. He bound and gagged the youngest Reyes with strips torn from the man's own shirt, then concealed him behind a stack of firewood. Retrieving his knife from where Victor had carelessly tossed it on a shelf, Mason slipped back inside the cabin. One by one, he secured the sleeping men, using their own belts and bandanas to bind and gag them before they could fully wake and raise the alarm. Victor Reyes was the last, and the only one Mason woke deliberately, pressing the recovered knife against the outlaw's throat as his eyes flew open. "Remember what I said about touching the widow or her children?" Mason asked, his voice dangerously soft. Fear flickered across Victor's face as he realized his predicament. His men subdued, his advantage lost to sleep and overconfidence. "The law will come for you, Reyes. Federal marshals, not local badges you can bribe. They'll find enough evidence in this cabin to hang all of you twice over." Mason increased the pressure of the blade slightly. "But if I ever hear you went near the Tucker homestead again, I won't wait for the law. Understand?" Victor's hateful glare was answer enough. Mason struck him once, hard enough to ensure several hours of unconsciousness, then bound him like the others. Outside, the world was transformed by the storm. 6 inches of fresh snow covered the ground, erasing tracks and softening the harsh lines of the wilderness. Mason retrieved Midnight from the lean-to shelter, saddling him with hands that had begun to shake from exhaustion and the aftermath of abuse. "Let's go home, old friend," he murmured, guiding the stallion away from the outlaw camp. Mason hadn't gone more than a mile when he spotted riders approaching, at least a dozen men led by a figure he recognized as Sheriff Collins from Cedar Springs. The lawman reined in sharply at the sight of Mason's battered face. "Hawthorne," he exclaimed, "we thought you were dead." "Not yet," Mason replied. "The Reyes gang is back at their cabin, all trussed up like Christmas geese. Might want to collect them before they work themselves loose." Collins signaled to his posse, sending most of them toward the outlaw hideout while he and 2 deputies remained with Mason. "Mrs. Tucker rode into town last night half frozen with all 5 youngsters," Collins explained. "Said you'd sacrificed yourself to save them. We got up a posse as soon as the storm let up enough to ride." Though the Reyes brothers were now behind bars awaiting transfer to the territorial prison, the effects of Mason's ordeal lingered. Nightmares haunted his sleep, not of his own torture, but visions of Sarah and the children in the outlaw's clutches. He would wake in a cold sweat, reaching instinctively for his gun. Dr. Thompson noticed Mason's hands trembling slightly during a checkup, an after effect of the damage to his nerves from the rope bindings that had been too tight for too long. "The shaking should improve with time," the doctor assured him, "but I'm more concerned about what those animals did to your mind than your body." Mason dismissed the concern. "I've had worse." "Maybe so," Thompson replied, eyeing him shrewdly, "but I'd wager you've never had people you cared about threatened before. That leaves different kinds of scars." The doctor's words struck uncomfortably close to home. In his years as a bounty hunter, Mason had dealt with threats and injuries as simply part of the profession. But now, each time Daniel ventured too far from town or Emma played outside the boarding house, Mason found himself scanning rooftops and alleyways, calculating threats, planning escape routes. "The Reyes brothers have friends," Sheriff Collins warned one afternoon. "Nasty ones. Word is some of their cousins from New Mexico might be heading this way for the trial." Mason nodded, absorbing this information with outward calm, while inwardly adding it to his growing mental map of potential dangers. He had chosen to stay, to build a life with Sarah and the children, but he was beginning to understand that his past would never completely release its hold on them. The realization only strengthened his resolve. The Reyes brothers had awakened something in Mason that went beyond his professional skills as a tracker and fighter, a fierce, protective instinct that would reshape him into whatever Sarah and the children needed him to be to keep them safe. "Sarah and the children are safe?" Mason asked, something tight in his chest easing at the news. Collins nodded. "Doc Thompson's looking after them. The littlest one had a bad cough, but they'll be fine." He studied Mason's face. "You, on the other hand, look like you tangled with a mountain cat." "Feels about the same," Mason admitted, swaying slightly in the saddle. "Let's get you back to town," Collins said, concern evident in his voice. "You can tell us the whole story once Doc's had a look at you." The ride back to Cedar Springs passed in a blur of pain and fatigue. By the time they reached the small settlement, Mason was barely conscious, staying upright through sheer will rather than strength. Willing hands helped him from Midnight's back and into the doctor's house, where he collapsed onto a cot and surrendered to the darkness that had been clawing at the edges of his vision. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices around him but unable to focus on their words. Cool hands touched his face. Gentle fingers probed his injuries. And at some point, he felt the sting of antiseptic on the worst of his cuts. When he finally opened his eyes fully, daylight was streaming through a window, illuminating a small, neat room he didn't recognize. He tried to sit up, only to fall back with a groan as his body reminded him of the beating it had endured. "Easy," a familiar voice cautioned. "Doc says you've got 2 cracked ribs," among other things. Mason turned his head to find Sarah Tucker sitting beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her face showing signs of exhaustion but relief in her eyes. "The children?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper. "All safe," she assured him. "Emma had a fever, but it's broken now. The others are helping at the general store. Mrs. Peterson is keeping them busy and fed." Mason nodded, then winced at the movement. "The Reyes gang?" "Sheriff Collins brought them in yesterday. They're being transferred to the territorial prison next week." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Everyone's calling you a hero." Mason closed his eyes, uncomfortable with the word. "I'm no hero." "You saved our lives," she said simply. "I endangered them first by being there." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Why did you do it? Give yourself up to them?" Mason was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "Because I've spent most of my life taking people away from their homes," he finally said. "It seemed time to keep someone in theirs." Something shifted in Sarah's eyes, a softening, a recognition. "The debt," she said, "you canceled it. It was never yours to pay." "But why help us? You didn't even know us a week ago." Mason looked away, focusing on the window where snow still clung to the edges of the glass. "I knew enough," he said quietly. Sarah seemed about to press further, but the door opened, admitting a gray-haired man with spectacles and a kindly face. Dr. Thompson, Mason presumed. "Ah, you're awake," the doctor said cheerfully. "Good, good. You had us worried for a spell there." He approached the bed and began examining Mason's injuries with practiced efficiency. "Fortunate man, Mr. Hawthorne. Despite their best efforts, the Reyes brothers didn't do any permanent damage. Those ribs will pain you for weeks, mind, and that cut above your eye will leave a scar, but you'll mend." "How long have I been here?" Mason asked. 2 days, Thompson replied, checking Mason's pulse. "Fever broke last night, thanks to Mrs. Tucker's excellent nursing. Hardly left your side, she didn't." Mason glanced at Sarah, who looked away, a faint color rising in her cheeks. "When can I travel?" Mason asked. The doctor frowned. "Travel? My dear fellow, you're in no condition to go anywhere for at least a week, probably 2. Those ribs need rest, and you've lost blood." "I have business that won't wait," Mason insisted. "Whatever it is, it will have to," Thompson said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer to finish your journey in a pine box." Before Mason could argue further, the door burst open and a small figure darted into the room. "Mama, Mr. Collins says the bad men are going to prison forever and—" Emma stopped short at the sight of Mason awake in the bed, her eyes growing wide. She clutched her new boots to her chest. She seemed to carry them everywhere, Sarah had explained earlier, and took a tentative step forward. "You're awake." "I am," Mason agreed, his voice gentling automatically. "Are you still hurt?" "Some." Emma nodded seriously, processing this information. Then, with the impulsive trust of childhood, she approached the bed and solemnly offered him one of her precious boots. "When I'm hurt, Mama lets me hold something special. You can borrow this if you want." The simple gesture struck Mason with unexpected force. He swallowed hard against a sudden tightness in his throat. "That's very kind," he managed, "but I think those boots belong on your feet, keeping them warm." Emma considered this, then nodded again. "I'll wear them for you then," she decided, sitting down to pull them on with great concentration. Sarah watched the interaction with an unreadable expression, something both tender and sad in her eyes. Dr. Thompson cleared his throat gently. "I'll check on you this evening, Mr. Hawthorne. Meanwhile, rest is the best medicine." He turned to Sarah. "Perhaps you should rest as well, Mrs. Tucker. You look exhausted." After they left, Mason found himself alone with his thoughts. The room felt suddenly empty without Sarah's quiet presence, without Emma's innocent concern. He stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar emotions stirring within him. For 15 years, he had lived by a simple code: Find the target, bring them in, collect the bounty. Relationships were temporary, attachments dangerous. Yet in less than a week, he had risked his life for a woman and 5 children he barely knew, had canceled a legitimate debt, had fought and killed to protect them. Wisai, the question haunted him as he drifted back to sleep, and in his dreams, he saw Sarah standing in the snow, her arms open to gather her mismatched family close, her eyes meeting his across a distance he didn't know how to cross. The next morning brought visitors, Daniel and Sophie, the 2 oldest Tucker children, escorted by the sheriff. They stood awkwardly at the foot of Mason's bed, clearly unsure of their welcome. "Mama's helping Emma get checked by the doctor," Sophie explained, her voice soft but clear. "We wanted to thank you for saving us from those bad men." "And for fixing the barn roof," Daniel added. "Nobody's fixed anything at our place since Pa died." Mason struggled to sit up, grimacing at the pain in his ribs. "Your mother does her best," he said. "She works harder than most men I've known." Daniel nodded. "She does everything, never complains." He hesitated, then blurted, "Were you really a bounty hunter? Did you catch criminals?" I did." "How many?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "Daniel," Sophie admonished, "that's not polite to ask." "It's all right," Mason assured him. "I stopped counting years ago. Enough to make a living." "Is that why you canceled Pa's debt?" Daniel pressed. "Because you had plenty of money already." Sheriff Collins, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared his throat uncomfortably at the direct question. "No," Mason answered honestly. "I canceled it because your mother earned it, working to keep you all together and safe." He looked at Sophie. "And because some things matter more than money." The girl's eyes, wise beyond her years, studied him intently. "Like what?" Mason found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain concepts he was only beginning to understand himself? "Like family," he said finally. "Like having a place where you belong." Something in Sophie's expression softened. "Do you have a family, Mr. Hawthorne?" The question was innocent, but hit with the force of a physical blow. "No," Mason answered. "No family." "Where do you belong then?" Daniel asked. Mason had no answer for that. After the children left, Sheriff Collins lingered, awkwardly shifting his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Tucker told me what you did," he said, "giving yourself up to the Reyes gang to protect her and the youngsters." Mason shrugged, then regretted the movement as pain lanced through his side. "That was a brave thing," Collins continued. "Foolish, maybe, but brave." "They'd have killed her and the children," Mason said. "I couldn't let that happen." Collins studied him thoughtfully. "You know, Hawthorne, we could use a man like you around here. Town's growing, needs a proper deputy. Pays not much, but it's steady work." Mason blinked, surprised by the offer. "I'm not a lawman, Sheriff." "You've brought in more criminals than most who wear a badge," Collins pointed out. "And you've shown you'll put others before yourself. That's what makes a good peace officer." "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not staying," Mason said. "Once I'm healed, I'm heading to California." Collins nodded, disappointed but not surprised. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. Cedar Springs could use a man with your skills." He settled his hat back on his head. "Think on it, at least." After the sheriff departed, Mason tried to rise from the bed. His body protested violently, but he managed to stand, leaning heavily against the wall. The simple act of dressing left him sweating and dizzy, but stubborn determination saw him through it. He needed air, needed to clear his head of these strange, unsettling thoughts that had plagued him since meeting Sarah Tucker and her children. Needed to remember who he was, a loner, a hunter, a man without attachments. The walk from the doctor's house to the hotel was only 100 yards, but it might as well have been 10 miles. Every step jarred Mason's injured ribs, and by the time he reached his destination, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold. The hotel clerk's eyes widened at his appearance, but Mason waved off his concerned questions and made his way slowly upstairs to the room he'd rented days earlier. Inside, his saddlebags waited where he'd left them. Mason sank onto the bed, breathing heavily from the exertion. When the worst of the pain subsided, he reached for the leather bag and withdrew his journal. The ledger fell open to the last page where Joshua Tucker's name remained, now crossed out with a single line. Mason stared at it for a long moment, then turned to a fresh page. Taking a pencil from the nightstand, he began to write. November 15th, 1887. The Tucker debt is settled. The widow and children will keep their home. I have filed the necessary papers and paid the bank what was owed. They should have no further financial concerns until spring. The Reyes brothers have been captured and will face justice for their crimes. They will not threaten this town again. My business here is concluded. Once recovered, I will continue to California as planned. Mason paused, pencil hovering over the paper. For 15 years, his journal had contained nothing but facts, names, dates, amounts. Never his thoughts, never his feelings. Those were luxuries a bounty hunter couldn't afford. Yet something compelled him to continue writing. Sarah Tucker is unlike any woman I have known. She has endured hardship that would break most men, yet remains unbent. She loves children not of her blood as fiercely as any mother could. She gives when she has nothing to spare. I find myself thinking of her more than is wise, of her courage, her honesty, the way she looks standing in the snow, protecting what is hers. This is foolishness. I am not a man meant for family or settlement. I would not know how to be what she and those children need. It is better that I leave once healed, better for all concerned. Mason closed the journal abruptly, disturbed by the direction of his thoughts. He returned it to his saddlebag, wincing as the movement pulled at his injuries. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. When he called out permission to enter, Sarah Tucker stepped into the room, her expression changing to one of alarm at the sight of him sitting on the edge of the bed, clearly in pain. "What are you doing?" she demanded, rushing forward. "Dr. Thompson said you weren't to leave your bed for at least 3 more days. "I needed to check my things," Mason replied, trying to sound stronger than he felt. "Your things aren't going anywhere," Sarah scolded, helping him lie back against the pillows. "But you might, straight to the cemetery, if you don't rest those ribs." Despite the pain, Mason found himself almost smiling at her fierce concern. "I've had worse." "That doesn't make you invincible," she retorted, pulling a chair closer to the bed. Her anger faded, replaced by something more difficult to define. "The children told me they visited you." Mason nodded. "Good kids. You've done well with them." Sarah's expression softened. "They're easy to love." She hesitated, then added, "Daniel asked if you were staying in Cedar Springs." "The sheriff offered me a job as deputy." "That would suit you," she said carefully, studying her hands. "The town respects you already, after what happened with the Reyes gang." "I'm heading to California once I'm healed," Mason said, more brusquely than he'd intended. Sarah looked up, something flickering in her amber eyes before she masked it. "Of course, you mentioned that before." She rose from the chair. "I should let you rest." "Sarah." Her name slipped out before he could stop it. She paused at the door, turning back. "Yes?" Mason found himself at a loss for words. What could he say? That he'd never felt as alive as he had defending her home? That the thought of leaving filled him with a hollowness he couldn't explain? That he was terrified by the power she and those children had to wound him simply by existing? "Thank you," he said instead, "for your help with my injuries." Something like disappointment crossed her face, but she nodded politely. "You're welcome, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll check on you tomorrow, if you'd like." After she left, Mason lay staring at the ceiling, his body aching but his mind in greater turmoil. Throughout his life, he had faced death without flinching, had tracked dangerous men across hundreds of miles, had survived conditions that killed lesser men. Yet nothing had frightened him as much as the feeling taking root in his chest, a feeling that threatened everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. Days passed. Mason's body began the slow process of healing, while his mind continued its internal battle. He forced himself to walk a little farther each day, rebuilding his strength even as Dr. Thompson scolded him for pushing too hard. Sarah visited daily, sometimes with one or more of the children, sometimes all alone. She brought home-cooked meals that tasted better than anything the hotel could provide, sat with him while he ate, and spoke of small, everyday matters. Emma's improving cough, Daniel's job helping at the livery stable, the generosity of the townspeople who had rallied to support them after the confrontation with the Reyes gang. "Mayor Collins says we can stay in town until the weather improves," she told him one afternoon. "Mrs. Peterson has offered Sophie a position helping in her store with proper wages." That's good, Mason said, watching her hands as she mended one of Emma's dresses. What about the homestead? We'll go back once the worst of winter passes, Sarah replied, her needle moving in neat, efficient stitches. The house needs work before next year's planting, but we'll manage. Mason thought of the rickety porch, the leaking roof, the poorly insulated walls. It's a hard place, he observed, barely keeping you all alive. Sarah's hand stilled. It's home, she said simply. There are better places, Mason pressed. Easier land to farm, towns with schools for the children. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. Are you suggesting we should leave after all this? Mason wasn't sure what he was suggesting. The words had emerged unbidden, fueled by a concern he didn't fully understand. I just want, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. What do you want, Mason? Sarah asked softly, using his given name for the first time. The question hung between them, laden with meanings neither was prepared to address directly. For you and the children to be safe, he finished lamely. To have what you need. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then returned to her sewing. We have what matters most, she said. Each other. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the barn roof. After a while, Sarah spoke again, her voice quiet in the dim light. Where is your family, Mason? He remained silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. But finally his voice came through the shadows. My mother died birthing me. Father unknown. Denver Orphans Home was where I grew up until I ran away at 12. Sarah said nothing, simply waited, knowing sometimes silence was the best invitation to trust. We were numbers there, Mason continued, his voice dropping lower. Number 37, that was me. Not Mason, just number 37. Every Sunday, wealthy couples would come, look us over like cattle at auction. He paused and Sarah could feel his struggle. I was chosen once, he admitted, words catching on old pain. A family in Colorado Springs. They needed a strong boy to help with their farm. But I didn't meet their expectations. Asked too many questions. Was too difficult. After 3 months, they brought me back. Mason stared into the darkness. The worst part wasn't being returned. It was how they talked about me as if I wasn't there. Like I was a horse that couldn't be broken. He's not suitable for our family, they told Father Timothy. Too headstrong, ungrateful. After that, I stopped trying. I didn't want to belong to anyone. Then one day I left, lived on the streets, did odd jobs, learned to fight, to survive. Eventually I found what I was good at, hunting men. Sarah reached out in the darkness, found his hand. And now, do you still think you can't belong anywhere? Mason gripped her hand hesitantly, as if unfamiliar with such gentle contact. I don't know how, he confessed. I don't know how to be part of this, of a family. No one taught me how to be mother to 5 children, Sarah said quietly. I just knew they needed me, and I couldn't let them down. Every day, I make mistakes, Mason, but I keep trying. That's all any of us can do. Mason didn't answer, but he didn't let go of her hand either. And Sarah understood that for a man who'd spent his life not feeling, not belonging, this was already a significant step. That evening, alone in his room, Mason had made a decision. He would leave as soon as he was strong enough to travel, within days, not weeks. Whatever this growing attachment was, it could only lead to pain. Sarah Tucker deserved better than a broken man who knew nothing of family or commitment. The children deserved someone who could be a true father, not a former bounty hunter with blood on his hands. He was packing his few belongings when another knock came at his door. Expecting Sarah, he was surprised to find Daniel standing in the hallway, his young face serious. Mrs. Peterson said you bought a ticket on tomorrow's stage to Prescott, the boy said without preamble. News traveled fast in small towns. Mason nodded. That's right. Daniel's expression hardened. You're leaving, just like that. My business here is finished, Mason said, uncomfortable under the boy's accusing stare. Your business, Daniel repeated, the words bitter. That's all we were to you? Business? Mason set down the shirt he'd been folding. Daniel, you made us think you cared, the boy interrupted, his voice rising. You fixed our barn. You fought those men to protect us. You gave Ma the deed to our land. I did care, Mason said. I do. Then why are you running away? Daniel demanded, tears beginning to shine in his eyes despite his obvious effort to contain them. We need you. Ma needs you. The words struck Mason like physical blows. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever met, he said carefully. She doesn't need anyone. That's not true, Daniel insisted. She cries at night when she thinks we're asleep. She's tired and scared, but she won't admit it. Mason hadn't known this, hadn't allowed himself to see beyond Sarah's capable exterior to the vulnerability she hid so well. I'm not the right person to help with that, he said gently. Why not? Daniel asked, his young face a study in confusion and hurt. Is it because we're poor? Because we're not really a family? No, Mason said firmly. None of those things. It's because... He hesitated, searching for words a 12-year-old might understand. It's because I don't know how to be what you need. I've been alone my whole life, Daniel. I don't know how to be part of a family. The boy stared at him for a long moment. Nobody taught Ma either, he said finally. She just does it, every day. With that simple statement, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Mason standing in the doorway, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling around him. As Daniel's footsteps faded down the hall, a painful memory surfaced. Mason suddenly saw himself at Daniel's age, standing before his temporary foster father, a farmer named Abernathy, as the man packed Mason's few belongings into a worn satchel. Why do I have to go? Young Mason had asked, struggling to control his voice. Because you don't fit, Abernathy had answered without meeting his eyes. Simple as that. But there was nothing simple about the pain of being abandoned again. Looking into Daniel's eyes now, Mason had seen the same fear, the same desperate defense. This boy had lost too much already, seen too many people leave and never return. Mason sank onto the edge of the bed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. In Daniel's defiance, in his protective stance toward his mother and siblings, Mason recognized himself, the wounded child who had become a solitary man. They both feared the same thing, abandonment, being unlovable, belonging nowhere. For the first time, Mason understood that his decision wasn't just about what he wanted or feared. It was about breaking or continuing a cycle of loss that had shaped his entire life. He couldn't sleep that night. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, joining the chorus of thoughts he'd been trying to silence since meeting Sarah Tucker. By dawn, Mason had given up the attempt at rest and sat by the window, watching as the town slowly came to life beneath a sky promising more snow. His ribs still ached, but the pain had receded to a dull throb rather than the sharp agony of days past. Dr. Thompson had grudgingly admitted he was healing well, warning only against sudden exertion or falls that might re-injure the cracked bones. Mason's gaze fell on his packed saddlebags, ready for the journey he'd planned. The stage would leave at noon, carrying him away from Cedar Springs, away from the Tucker family, away from the uncomfortable emotions that had taken root in his chest. It was the sensible choice, the only choice that made sense for a man like him. Why then did it feel like the greatest cowardice of his life? A flicker of movement in the street below caught his attention. Sarah emerged from the boarding house across the way, wrapped in her shawl against the morning chill. She walked with purpose toward the general store, her slender figure moving gracefully despite the muddy street. Mason watched her until she disappeared from view, a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with his injuries. He had faced death countless times without flinching, had tracked murderers across desert and mountain, had built a reputation that made hardened criminals surrender rather than face him. Yet the thought of walking up to Sarah Tucker and saying what was in his heart terrified him beyond reason. Because if he did, if he admitted to himself and to her what he was beginning to feel, there would be no going back. No retreating to the solitary existence he had always known. It would mean committing to something he had no experience with, no model for, no certainty he could succeed at. It would mean risking failure at something that mattered more than any bounty or reputation. Mason turned from the window, his decision made. He would catch the stage as planned, would travel to California and start fresh, as he had intended all along. Would put Cedar Springs and the Tucker family firmly in his past. It was better this way, better for all concerned. He reached for his coat, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing ribs. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Emma Tucker peered into the room, her small face solemn. "Mama says you're leaving today," she said without preamble. Mason nodded, unable to find words in the face of her directness. Emma stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. She clutched something in her small hands, a piece of paper, Mason realized. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out, "so you won't forget us." Mason took the offered paper. It was a childish drawing done in charcoal, a house with 5 stick figures in front of it, and a 6th, taller figure standing slightly apart. Even with his limited artistic appreciation, Mason recognized himself in that lonely sentinel. "That's you," Emma confirmed, pointing to the tall figure. "Watching over us, like you did." Something inside Mason's chest twisted painfully. "It's a fine drawing," he managed. Emma beamed at the praise, then grew serious again. "Are you leaving because you don't like us?" "No," Mason said firmly. "That's not it at all." Then why? How could he explain his fears to a 5-year-old when he barely understood them himself? "Sometimes adults have to go places they don't want to," he said finally. "It doesn't mean they don't care." Emma considered this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "But you'll come back? Promise?" The hope in her eyes was almost unbearable. Mason had made few promises in his life and had broken none. He couldn't bring himself to make one now that he wasn't certain he could keep. "I can't promise that, Emma," he said gently. Her face fell, but she nodded with a child's acceptance of adult mysteries. "Will you at least say goodbye to Mama? She said you're going." The simple statement hit with more force than any physical blow. "How do you know that?" "She looks at your picture," Emma explained, as if it were obvious. "The one Sophie drew of you when you were fixing our barn. She looks at it and gets that same face she had when we buried Pa." Mason felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Before he could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Sarah herself, her expression changing from composed to flustered at the sight of her youngest daughter in Mason's room. "Emma, I told you not to bother Mr. Hawthorne," she scolded gently. "He needs to rest before his journey." "It's all right," Mason assured her. "She brought me a drawing." Sarah's eyes fell on the paper in his hands, and something like embarrassment crossed her face. "I hope it's better than the last one she gave the sheriff. Poor man couldn't tell if it was a horse or a mountain." Emma giggled. "It was a horse on a mountain, Mama." Sarah smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Go find Sophie now, sweetheart. It's time for your reading lesson." When Emma had gone, an awkward silence fell between the adults. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped before her, while Mason remained by the window, the child's drawing still in his grasp. "I came to wish you safe travels," Sarah said finally. "The stage is reliable, even in winter, but the pass can be treacherous." "Thank you," Mason replied, the words feeling wholly inadequate. "Will you write?" she asked suddenly. "To let us know you arrived safely?" The request surprised him. "If you'd like," Sarah nodded, her gaze dropping to her clasped hands. "The children would appreciate it. They've grown attached to you." "And you?" The question escaped before Mason could stop it. Sarah looked up, vulnerability and something more complex shining in her amber eyes. "I've learned to be careful with attachments," she said softly. "They rarely last." The words struck Mason with unexpected force. In them, he heard the echo of his own fear, the fear of caring too much, of risking loss, of opening oneself to pain. They stood looking at each other across the small room, two people who had known too much solitude, too much loss, too much disappointment, two people afraid to reach for what they might find in each other. "Sarah," Mason began, not knowing what he would say but needing to break the charged silence. She shook her head quickly as if anticipating his words. "Don't," she said, "please, don't say anything that will make this harder than it already is." Before he could respond, she turned and left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like the final period at the end of a story. Mason stood motionless, Emma's drawing clutched in his hand, feeling as if something essential had just slipped through his fingers. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window like silent witnesses to his indecision. The stage would leave in 3 hours. 3 hours to decide the course of his life. 3 hours to choose between the safe, familiar solitude he had always known and the terrifying, exhilarating unknown of allowing himself to care, truly care, for the first time in his life. Mason Hawthorne had faced many crossroads in his 35 years. None had ever felt as consequential as this one. The stagecoach arrived in Cedar Springs with a clatter of hooves and creaking wheels, pulling up before the town's single hotel in a swirl of snow. The driver, bundled against the cold, jumped down to open the door for waiting passengers, while his assistant began unloading mail and packages. From his window, Mason watched the scene unfold like a painting coming to life. Two travelers climbed aboard, a businessman in an expensive coat and a young woman clutching a carpet bag. The driver checked his pocket watch, looked up and down the street, then called out, "Last call for Prescott!" Mason stood perfectly still, Emma's drawing in one hand, his ticket in the other. The stagecoach would take him away from here, away from the complications of feelings he didn't understand, away from the terrifying possibility of failure. California waited with its promise of a fresh start, a new life where no one knew his name or reputation. All he had to do was walk downstairs, board the coach, and leave Cedar Springs behind. Instead, Mason found himself remembering Sarah's face as she'd stood in his doorway, the careful composure hiding a vulnerability that matched his own. He thought of Daniel's accusation, "You're running away," of Emma's innocent question, "Will you come back? Promise?" For 15 years, he had lived by a simple code: complete the bum, collect the bounty, move on. Never linger, never attach, never care too deeply. It had kept him alive in a dangerous profession, had protected him from the pain of connection and loss, but it had also left him profoundly alone. Outside, the driver called again, impatience evident in his voice. "Last chance for Prescott. We're pulling out." Mason looked down at the child's drawing, at the stick figure standing apart from the others, watching over them. Is that how they saw him? As a protector? As someone who belonged in their story, even if at a distance? The thought pierced something deep in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart years ago. With sudden clarity, Mason knew he couldn't leave. Not like this, not without at least trying to understand what Sarah Tucker and her children had come to mean to him. What kind of man he might become if he allowed himself to care for them. The stagecoach driver shouted a final warning. Mason watched as the man climbed back onto his seat, taking up the reins. The coach lurched forward, wheels turning in the snow, carrying its passengers west toward Prescott and points beyond. Without him. Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He carefully folded Emma's drawing and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he gathered his few belongings and walked downstairs to the hotel lobby. "Decided not to travel after all, Mr. Hawthorne?" the clerk asked, surprised. "Change of plans," Mason replied. "I'll be keeping the room a while longer." Outside, the snow fell steadily, softening the hard edges of the frontier town. Mason stood on the hotel porch, watching people hurry about their business, collars turned up against the cold. Across the street, he could see the boarding house where Sarah and the children were staying. What now? He had chosen to stay, but to what end? What could he possibly offer Sarah Tucker that she couldn't provide for herself? What did a former bounty hunter know about being a husband, a father, a provider? Before he could answer these questions, a shout rang out down the street. A rider came galloping through town, horse-lathered despite the cold, sliding to a stop before the sheriff's office. "Fire!" the man yelled. "The Tucker place is burning!" Mason's blood froze. He was moving before conscious thought, pain forgotten as he ran toward the commotion forming outside the sheriff's office. "What happened?" he demanded, grabbing the rider's arm. The man, a rancher from the valley, turned with wild eyes. Lightning struck the barn at the Tucker homestead. Winds whipping it toward the house, sheriffs gathering men to ride out. "Mrs. Tucker and the children are safe in town," someone in the crowd reassured. But Mason wasn't thinking about their safety now. He was thinking of the house, the only home those children had known, the place Sarah had fought so hard to keep. If it burned, they would have nothing left. Sheriff Collins emerged from his office, buckling on his gun belt. "Need volunteers," he called. "Bucket Brigade. Anyone with a horse, meet at the livery in 5 minutes." Mason was already running toward the stable. Within minutes, he had saddled Midnight and joined the group of riders assembling in the street. Collins nodded in approval at Mason's presence, then addressed the gathered men. "Ride hard, but careful. That storm's getting worse." He pointed at the dark clouds massing over the mountains. "Johnson, Perez, bring the water wagon. The rest of you, anything that can hold water. Buckets, pots, blankets to beat back flames." As the group prepared to depart, a voice called from down the street. "Wait!" Sarah Tucker ran toward them, her shawl flying behind her like a banner. Daniel and Sophie followed close behind, determination etched on their young faces. "That's our home," Sarah said, breathless as she reached the gathering. "I'm coming with you." "Mrs. Tucker," Collins began, clearly uncomfortable. "This is dangerous work." "It's my home," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "My children's future." Mason dismounted, approaching her with urgency. "Sarah, stay here. We'll do everything we can." "I can help," she insisted, her eyes meeting his with fierce intensity. "I know that land, that house, better than anyone." Mason recognized the determination in her face, the same unyielding strength that had kept her and 5 orphaned children alive against impossible odds. He nodded once, then turned to Collins. "She rides with me," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. "The youngsters stay," he insisted, looking at Daniel and Sophie. "But," Daniel began to protest. "No arguments," Sarah cut him off. "Stay with Emma, Grace, and Ethan. Mrs. Peterson will look after you." Sophie placed a restraining hand on her brother's arm. "We will," she promised, her wise eyes understanding what Daniel's anger couldn't yet grasp, that their mother needed to fight for their home without worrying about them. Mason helped Sarah mount behind him on midnight, her arms circling his waist for balance. Despite the circumstances, he couldn't help but notice the warmth of her body pressed against his back, the trust implied in her embrace. "Hold tight," he warned as Collins gave the signal to ride. The group thundered out of town, hooves pounding against the snow-covered trail. The sky had darkened ominously, the winter storm gathering strength as they rode. Mason felt Sarah's grip tighten as they galloped across the open ground, her breath warm against his neck. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind, "for staying." Before Mason could respond, the Tucker homestead came into view, and with it, the devastation. The barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching skyward in angry tongues of orange and red. Sparks carried by the wind had already ignited the corner of the house nearest the barn, smoke billowing from the roof. "No!" Sarah's anguished cry tore at Mason's heart. The riders dismounted in a flurry of activity. Collins shouted orders, organizing the men into teams, some to carry water from the nearby creek, others to form a bucket line, still others to beat at the flames with wet blankets. Mason helped Sarah down, her face ashen as she stared at her burning home. "We can save it," he promised, though he wasn't certain they could. "Tell me what's most important inside." "The children's things," she answered immediately. "Under their beds, boxes with keepsakes from their parents. And in my room, a small trunk with letters, photographs." Mason nodded. "Stay here." Before she could object, he ran toward the house, joining the men fighting to save it. The heat was intense, smoke billowing in great clouds that stung his eyes and burned his lungs. The fire had spread to the roof now, eating away at the wooden shingles with hungry determination. Inside, Mason moved quickly through the small rooms, gathering the precious items Sarah had described. He found the children's boxes, simple wooden containers containing pitiful treasures. A doll missing an arm, a carved wooden horse, a tarnished pocket watch, a mother's handkerchief, a father's pipe. In Sarah's room, he located the trunk she'd mentioned, securing it under his arm before heading back toward the door. As he reached the main room, a burning beam crashed down behind him, blocking the way he'd come. Smoke filled the space, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Mason crouched low, moving toward the front door, his lungs screaming for clean air. Outside, Sarah watched in horror as flames consumed more of the house. When Mason had not emerged after several minutes, she started forward, only to be restrained by Sheriff Collins. "You can't go in there, Mrs. Tucker," he insisted. "It's too dangerous." "Mason's inside," she cried, struggling against his grip. "Let me go." Just then the front door burst open and Mason staggered out, his arms full of the rescued treasures. His face was streaked with soot, His coat singed, but his eyes sought Sarah's immediately. She broke free from Collins and ran to him, relief evident in every line of her body. Mason handed the precious items to waiting hands, then doubled over in a fit of coughing, his lungs expelling the smoke he'd inhaled. "You foolish, brave man," Sarah choked, tears cutting clean tracks down her soot-stained face. Mason straightened, reaching out to touch her cheek briefly. "Worth it," he managed before turning back to the burning building. For 2 hours, they fought the fire with everything they had: water from the creek, snow shoveled onto flames, wet blankets beating back the advancing destruction. The men worked with the grim determination of frontier people who understood that a home was more than just shelter. It was livelihood, future, hope. But nature proved stronger. The wind increased, fanning the flames higher, and their water supply dwindled as the creek began to freeze in the plummeting temperature. "It's lost," Collins finally called, his voice heavy with defeat. "Everyone back! The roof's about to go!" The men retreated to a safe distance, watching as the roof of the Tucker homestead collapsed inward with a terrible groaning crash. Sparks shot skyward, dancing against the darkening sky like malevolent fireflies. Sarah stood motionless, her face reflecting the dying flames of everything she had fought so hard to preserve. Mason moved to her side, uncertain what comfort he could possibly offer in the face of such loss. "I'm sorry," he said simply, the words painfully inadequate. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the smoldering ruins. Then slowly she turned to face him, her expression shifting from devastation to a strange, fierce resolve. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice stronger than he would have thought possible. "We'll rebuild, start over." Mason marveled at her resilience. Any other person might have broken under the weight of this final blow. Not Sarah Tucker. If anything, the disaster seemed to have crystallized her determination. "Yes," he agreed, "we will." She caught the pronoun, her eyes widening slightly. "We?" Before Mason could elaborate, Collins approached, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Tucker. We did what we could." "I know, Sheriff. Thank you, all of you, for trying." Sarah's dignity in the face of disaster was humbling. "At least we saved the children's keepsakes." "What will you do now?" Collins asked. "Stay in town until spring," Sarah answered without hesitation. "Work, save, start rebuilding as soon as the weather permits." Collins nodded, clearly impressed by her resolve. "The town will help," he promised. "Cedar Springs takes care of its own." As the men began to gather their equipment and prepare for the ride back to town, Mason pulled Collins aside. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Tucker alone," he said quietly. "We'll follow shortly." The sheriff's eyebrows rose, but he nodded in understanding. "Don't linger too long," he warned, glancing at the darkening sky. "That storm's nearly upon us." After the others had ridden away, Mason approached Sarah, who stood silently before the ruins of her home. Snow had begun to fall again, hissing as it touched the still hot embers. "It's strange," she said without turning. "I never loved this place. It was always too small, too broken, too isolated." She paused, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "But it was ours, the only home the children have known since losing their parents." "You gave them something more important than a house," Mason said. "You gave them a family." Sarah turned to him then, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. "Why did you stay?" she asked directly. "The stagecoach left hours ago." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Because some journeys matter more than others." "What does that mean, Mason?" Her voice held a note of frustration. "No more half answers, no more cryptic statements. Why did you miss that stage?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. Mason took a deep breath, aware that he was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I stayed because the thought of leaving you, all of you, felt like cutting off a limb," he admitted. "Because in less than 2 weeks, you and those children have become more important to me than anything has in 15 years. Sarah's expression softened, vulnerability replacing frustration. "We have nothing now," she said, gesturing toward the smoldering ruins. "Less than when you arrived." "That's not true." Mason stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "You have 5 children who love you. You have a town that respects you, and—" he hesitated, then pushed forward. "And you have me." if you want me." The words hung between them, as fragile and substantial as the snowflakes falling around them. Sarah's eyes widened, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. "What are you saying, Mason?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I want to stay," he answered. "Not just in Cedar Springs, but with you, with the children. I'm saying I want to help rebuild this place, make it a real home." He swallowed hard. "I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Tucker. And it terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced." Sarah's breath caught audibly. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, emotions playing across her face too quickly to identify. "You don't know what you're asking," she finally said. "5 children, a burned-out farm, a woman who can't give you children of your own." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Mason corrected gently. "A family, a purpose beyond hunting men for money, a chance to be something more than I've been." He reached out, hesitantly brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I won't pretend I know how to be a husband or a father," he continued. "I'll make mistakes, probably many of them. But I promise you this, I will never stop trying. I will never walk away. Not from you, not from them." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "Why?" she asked again, her voice trembling slightly. "Why us? Why now?" Mason considered the question, wanting to give her the truth she deserved. "Because you showed me something I didn't know existed," he said finally. "A strength that doesn't come from a gun or physical power. The kind that builds rather than destroys." He gestured toward the ruins of the house. "Look what you've done, Sarah. 5 orphaned children who would have been separated, lost in a system that doesn't care. You held them together, gave them love, stability, hope. Despite everything, a dead husband who mistreated you, poverty, hardship, you never stopped fighting for them." Mason took her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller ones. "I've spent my life tracking people who've broken their word, broken the law, broken trust. And then I found you, someone who builds, who keeps promises, who creates family from nothing but will and love." A single tear escaped, tracking down Sarah's cheek. Mason brushed it away with his thumb. "I can't promise you wealth," he said, "but I can promise loyalty, protection, and a willingness to learn how to love properly. If you'll have me." Snow continued to fall around them, the flakes growing larger as the storm intensified. The world had narrowed to just this, 2 people standing amid ruins, facing a future neither had anticipated. "The children," Sarah began, then stopped. "They've lost so much already. If you came into their lives, became a father to them, and then left." "I won't leave," Mason vowed. "Not by choice, ever." Sarah studied him, seeming to weigh his words against some internal scale. Then slowly she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her free hand came up to rest against his chest, directly above his heart. "I think," she said quietly, "I started falling in love with you the day you left those boots for Emma. When a man who claims to care only for debts and justice sees a child's bleeding feet and does something about it." She took a shaky breath. "How could I not love that man?" Joy, an emotion so foreign Mason barely recognized it, surged through him. Acting on instinct rather than thought, he drew Sarah into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because he realized she was. "Is that a yes?" he murmured against her hair. Sarah leaned back, her face tilted up to his. "It's a yes," she confirmed, "but on one condition." "Name it." "That you understand what you're getting," she said seriously. 5 children, Mason, Fiam, with nightmares and questions and needs. A woman who can't have more. A farm that needs to be completely rebuilt. Winters where we might struggle to eat. Mason smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern features. "I understand exactly what I'm getting," he assured her, "and it's more than I ever thought I'd have." The wind had picked up, driving the snow nearly sideways now. Mason glanced at the darkening sky with concern. "We need to get back to town," he said reluctantly. "This storm's worsening." Sarah nodded, but before they could move toward midnight, she reached up and touched his face. "Mason," she said softly, "thank you for staying, for choosing us." In answer, he lowered his head and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. It was a kiss of promise, of new beginnings amid destruction, of hope that had survived against impossible odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathless despite the cold, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he said. "Home?" Sarah questioned. "We just watched it burn." Mason shook his head. "Home isn't a place," he said, the words feeling right as they left his mouth. "It's people. It's where you belong. And I belong with you and those children, wherever that may be." They rode back to Cedar Springs through the deepening snow, Sarah's arms wrapped securely around Mason's waist, her cheek resting against his back. Despite the day's losses, despite the uncertainty ahead, Mason felt a peace he had never known, as if some restless part of his soul had finally found its place in the world. In town, they found the children waiting anxiously at the boarding house, their faces lighting up with relief as Mason and Sarah entered, snow-covered but safe. Daniel's expression remained guarded, however, his young eyes assessing Mason with lingering suspicion. "The house?" Sophie asked quietly, already knowing the answer from their faces. "Gone," Sarah confirmed gently. "But we saved your special boxes, and we'll rebuild when spring comes." Emma pushed forward, her small face solemn. "Where will we live now, Mama?" "Here in town, until the weather breaks," Sarah answered, kneeling to the child's level. "Mrs. Peterson has offered Sophie a job at the store, and Mr. Collins says Daniel can help at the livery stables." "And then?" Daniel asked, his voice challenging. "What happens after winter?" Sarah glanced up at Mason, a question in her eyes. He nodded, understanding what she was asking. This was her announcement to make. "After winter," she said carefully, "we'll rebuild our home. A better home. And—" she took a deep breath. "And Mr. Hawthorne will be helping us." Four of the children reacted with varying degrees of surprise and excitement. Emma immediately threw herself at Mason's legs, hugging him with unrestrained joy. Grace and Ethan exchanged confused but hopeful glances. Sophie's wise eyes darted between Sarah and Mason, understanding dawning in them. Only Daniel remained still, his expression unreadable. "For how long?" he asked Mason directly. "For good," Mason replied, meeting the boy's gaze steadily. "If that's all right with you." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Why, Daniel," Sarah began, a note of warning in her voice. "No, it's a fair question," Mason interrupted gently. He moved to stand before the 12-year-old, respecting him enough to answer honestly. "Because I love your mother," he said simply, "and because I care about all of you more than I thought possible." But Daniel's suspicion didn't waver. "You were leaving, on the stage." "I was," Mason acknowledged. "I was afraid." "You," Daniel scoffed. "Sheriff says you're not afraid of anything." "He's wrong," Mason said. "I was afraid of caring too much, of not being good enough for you all, of failing at something that matters." The boy absorbed this, clearly surprised by the admission. "And now you're not afraid?" "Oh, I still am," Mason admitted with a small smile. "But I've learned something important. Sometimes the things most worth doing are also the most frightening." Daniel studied him for a long moment, weighing his words with a maturity beyond his years. Finally, he extended his hand, a man's gesture from a boy becoming one too quickly. "If you ever hurt my mother," he said seriously as Mason took his hand, "I'll come after you, no matter how old I am." Mason nodded, respecting the boy's protective instinct. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. "But I promise you, Daniel, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her, and of all of you." Something in the boy's stance eased slightly, though his handshake remained firm. "We'll see," he said, but the words held less challenge than before. Later that evening, after the children had been settled for the night, Mason and Sarah sat alone before the boarding house fire. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling around the eaves like a wild thing seeking entry. Inside, warmth and tentative peace prevailed. "Daniel will come around," Sarah said, watching the flames dance. "He's protective. Has been ever since Joshua died." "He has every right to be," Mason replied. "He's had to be the man of the family for too long." Sarah's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "How do we do this, Mason?" she asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. "Neither of us knows how to build this kind of life." Mason considered the question, understanding its depth. "One day at a time," he said finally. "Together." He turned to face her fully, clasping both her hands in his. "I spoke with Collins before I came here tonight," he said. He's still offering that deputy position. It's not much pay, but it's steady work, respected. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. You'd do that? Give up the freedom of your old life? What freedom? Mason countered gently. Moving from town to town, hunting men who'd kill me if given half a chance, sleeping with one eye open, never staying anywhere long enough to be known? He shook his head. That wasn't freedom, Sarah. It was running. She studied him, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. And now? Now I want to build something, he said simply. With you. A home, a family, a life that creates instead of destroys. Sarah's expression softened into something that made Mason's heart skip. I think, she said quietly, that you'll be very good at building, Mason Hawthorne. We'll build it together, he promised, all 7 of us. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Cedar Springs emerged from beneath a fresh blanket of snow, buildings and fences transformed into fairy tale versions of themselves. Mason stood on the boarding house porch, watching as the town came to life. Shopkeepers shoveling paths to their doors, children throwing snowballs despite the bitter cold, women exchanging news at the communal water pump. For the first time, he looked at the frontier settlement not as a temporary stop on an endless journey, but as a place he might belong. A community rather than just a collection of buildings. A home. The door opened behind him. Mason expected Sarah, but instead 7-year-old Grace stepped onto the porch, a folded paper clutched in her small hand. Of all the children, she was the quietest, rarely speaking, even when addressed directly. Mason had sometimes wondered if she was afraid of him. Good morning, he said gently, careful not to startle her. Grace didn't reply but approached with cautious steps. When she reached him, she held out the paper without meeting his eyes. Mason unfolded it to find a charcoal drawing, surprisingly skilled for one so young, of himself standing protectively before the family, his stance shielding them from shadowy figures that could only be the Reyes brothers. This is very good, he said, genuinely impressed. You have a gift, Grace. The girl glanced up briefly, a flash of pleasure crossing her usually solemn face. You saved us, she whispered, her voice so soft Mason had to lean down to hear. Like in the story. What story, he asked. The one about the knight who protects people from monsters. She fidgeted with the edge of her dress. Sophie reads it to me sometimes. Mason felt something catch in his throat. I'm no knight, Grace. The girl studied him with serious eyes that seemed to see far more than her years should allow. You could be, she said simply. Then, in a surprising gesture that caught Mason completely off guard, she stepped forward and hugged him quickly before darting back inside. The door opened again, and Sarah stepped out, wrapped in her shawl. Beautiful, isn't it? She said, nodding toward the snow-covered landscape. After a storm, everything looks clean. New. Mason slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her against his side. A fresh start, he agreed. For all of us, she added, resting her head against his shoulder. They stood in companionable silence, watching the town awaken. After a while, Sarah spoke again, her voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about the house, she said. When we rebuild. What about it? It should be bigger, she decided. More windows, a proper porch where we can sit in the evenings. Mason smiled at the certainty in her voice. Anything else? A room for each of the children, she continued, warming to the subject. And maybe a study for you? A place for your books and papers. The suggestion touched him deeply. Sarah was already carving out a space for him in her vision of their future, making room for him in more ways than one. I'd like that, he said softly. She turned in his embrace, looking up at him with an expression that made his breath catch. I want you to know, she said seriously, that I'm not marrying you for security or because the children need a father. Those things are true, but they're not why. Mason waited, giving her the space to continue. I'm marrying you, Mason Hawthorne, because in you I see a man of honor, a man who keeps his word, who defends the defenseless, who sees value in things others overlook. Her hands came up to frame his face. A man who looked at a struggling widow with 5 orphaned children and saw not a burden, but a gift. Mason would have responded, but a sound from inside caught their attention. They turned to see Ethan and Grace watching them from the doorway. their expressions a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Does this mean you're staying for good?" Ethan asked, his usual reserve giving way to cautious excitement. "You'll be our pa now?" The directness of the question momentarily took Mason aback. While Daniel's resistance and Emma's immediate acceptance had been clear, Ethan and Grace had remained enigmas to him, observing silently, revealing little. "If that would be all right with you," Mason answered carefully. Grace looked up at her brother, then back at Mason. "Will you teach me more about drawing, like you showed me with the shadows yesterday?" Mason remembered the impromptu lesson he'd given her, how to use charcoal to create depth, how light and shadow define the world. She'd been an attentive student, absorbing every word. "Of course I will," he promised. "And will you show me how to build things?" Ethan added, growing bolder. "Like that pulley at the well? I want to learn how things work." Mason felt something expand in his chest, the realization that these two quiet, watchful children had been paying attention to him all along, finding their own connections to this stranger who had entered their lives. "I'll teach you everything I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you." The siblings exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them, before Ethan nodded once, decisively. "Then it's all right if you stay," he declared, as if the matter were now officially settled. Grace's solemn face brightened with a rare smile. "We can be a real family," she said softly. Mason felt Sarah's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. Looking at the two children in the doorway, the ones who had watched and waited, who had formed their judgments quietly, he understood that he had truly been accepted by all 5 children now, each in their own way. Mason swallowed hard against the emotion rising in his throat. "They are a gift," he managed. "You all are." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "So are you," she whispered. "More than you know." Behind them, the boarding house door burst open, and Emma tumbled out, her face alight with excitement. "Mason, Mama, come quick. Sophie's teaching Ethan to read, and he's doing it." Sarah laughed, the sound like music in the crisp morning air. "We're coming, sweetheart." As they turned to follow the child inside, Mason paused, looking once more at the snow-covered town. In the distance, beyond the buildings and fences, he could just make out the valley where the Tucker homestead had stood and would stand again. 4 years ago, a desperate man named Joshua Tucker had found Mason half dead in the snow and, for better or worse, had brought him into his home. That chance encounter had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment, to a future Mason had never imagined possible. "Mason?" Sarah's voice called him back to the present. "Are you coming?" He turned to her with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm coming home." Spring came early that year, the snow retreating from the valley by mid-March. As the earth awakened from its winter slumber, the Tucker land, now the Hawthorne Tucker homestead, buzzed with activity. The entire town had rallied behind the family, contributing labor, materials, and time to the rebuilding effort. Mason, now officially Cedar Springs' deputy sheriff, worked from dawn until dusk alongside the volunteers, his knowledge of construction proving surprisingly extensive. "Where did you learn to frame a roof like that?" Collins asked one afternoon, watching Mason notch a beam with practiced precision. "Spent a winter with a master carpenter in Colorado," Mason replied. "Man I was tracking broke his leg. Had to wait 3 months for him to heal enough to travel. Figured I might as well learn something useful while waiting." By April, the new house stood nearly complete, larger than its predecessor, sturdier, with the windows and porch Sarah had envisioned. The barn was rising nearby, its framework a promise of future prosperity. On a warm Saturday in late April, Mason and Sarah Hawthorne stood hand in hand before the new home, surrounded by the 5 children and half the town of Cedar Springs. The circuit preacher had ridden in specifically for the occasion, his Bible open as he pronounced the words that officially joined them as husband and wife. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Mason leaned down to kiss his bride, Emma burst into delighted applause, setting off a wave of cheers and well wishes from the assembled townsfolk. Even Daniel smiled, his young face showing the first real acceptance of his new stepfather. Later, as the celebration continued with food and music in the newly completed barn, Mason found himself standing slightly apart, watching as Sarah danced with each of the children in turn. Her laughter floated above the fiddle music, her face alight with a joy he had never seen before that winter day when he had chosen to stay. Sheriff Collins joined him, offering a glass of whiskey. "Never thought I'd see the day," he remarked, following Mason's gaze to where Sarah now danced with little Emma perched on her feet. Mason Hawthorne, notorious bounty hunter, settled down with a ready-made family. Mason accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Suits you, though," Collins observed. "Never seen you look so at peace." Peace, yes, that was it exactly. For the first time in his life, Mason felt truly at peace. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years had quieted, replaced by something deeper, more satisfying, a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond the next hunt or bounty. "It does suit me," he agreed quietly, "more than I deserve." Collins clapped him on the shoulder. "Every man deserves a chance at happiness, Hawthorne. Even you." As the sheriff moved away to join another group, Sarah approached, her cheeks flushed from dancing, her amber eyes bright with happiness. "Why are you hiding in the corner, Deputy Hawthorne?" she teased, slipping her hand into his. "Afraid someone might make you dance?" Mason smiled down at her, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen him. "Just watching," he said, taking it all in. Sarah's expression softened into understanding. "Overwhelming, isn't it? All of this, the children, the house." She squeezed his hand. "Marriage. In the best possible way," he assured her. Her smile widened. "I have something for you," she said, an undercurrent of excitement in her voice. "A wedding gift." "Sarah, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," she interrupted. "Come with me." Curious, Mason allowed her to lead him away from the celebration, across the yard to the new house. Inside, she guided him to the room they had designated as his study, a small space with a window overlooking the valley, currently empty save for a desk Collins had helped him build. On the desk sat a wooden box, polished to a soft glow. Sarah gestured for him to open it. Inside, Mason found a leather-bound book, its cover unmarked, its pages blank. Nestled beside it was a handsome fountain pen. "Your old journal was for debts and bounties," Sarah explained. "I thought you might like a new one, for different kinds of entries." Mason lifted the book carefully, running his fingers over its smooth cover. "What kind of entries?" he asked. Sarah smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Whatever you want. The children's milestones. Our first year together." She paused, her expression growing more serious. The story of how a man who thought he could only destroy learned to build instead. The simple gift, and the thought behind it, moved Mason deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's perfect." Sarah stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "Are you happy, Mason?" she asked, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "With this life? With us?" In answer, Mason set the journal aside and gathered her in his arms. "More than I ever thought possible," he said softly against her hair. "More than I knew how to imagine." Through the open window came the sounds of their wedding celebration. Music, laughter, the clear, bright voices of children playing. Beyond, the valley stretched toward distant mountains, the land they would work together, the future they would build day by day. Mason Hawthorne, who had once tracked men through wilderness and brought them to justice, had finally found his own redemption. Not in the barrel of a gun or the collection of a bounty, but in the arms of a woman strong enough to teach him how to love, and in the eyes of 5 children brave enough to let him try to be their father. After the celebration, as dusk settled over the homestead, Mason found Ethan in the new barn, examining the pulley system they had designed together for moving hay to the loft. "It worked perfect today when we brought in the supplies for the party," the boy said proudly. "Just like you said it would." "That's because you built it right," Mason replied, noting how the child stood taller at the praise. "You have good hands for building, Ethan." "Pa," Ethan paused, testing the word carefully. It was the first time he'd addressed Mason this way. "Pa, I think I want to build things when I grow up. Maybe houses or bridges." The simple declaration and the title that preceded it filled Mason with quiet joy. "You'll build fine things," he assured the boy. "I have no doubt." Later, he found Grace sitting on the porch steps, sketching in the small notebook he'd given her for her 8th birthday 2 months earlier. "May I see?" he asked, sitting beside her. Grace handed him the notebook. The page showed a detailed drawing of the family, all seven of them, standing before their new home. Unlike Emma's childish drawings, Grace's work showed remarkable skill, capturing not just appearances but something of each person's essence. Daniel's protective stance, Sophie's watchful calm, Emma's unbridled joy, Ethan's quiet curiosity, Sarah's gentle strength. And Mason himself, drawn not as the dangerous bounty hunter of old, but as the steady center of the family, one hand on Sarah's shoulder, the other holding his sheriff's badge. "This is how I see us now," Grace explained softly. Mason studied the drawing, touched by how she'd captured this new reality they'd created together. "It's perfect," he said. "Would you mind if I kept this one?" Grace nodded, carefully removing the page from her notebook. "For your study," she said, "so you'll remember even when you're working." "I could never forget," Mason assured her, but he accepted the drawing with reverence, understanding the gift it truly was, a vision of himself through his daughter's eyes, transformed from the man he had been to the man he had become. That night, after the guests had departed and the children had fallen asleep in their new rooms, Mason sat at his desk with the journal open before him. Grace's drawing lay beside it, a visual testimony to the journey he had made. For a long moment, he simply stared at the blank page, pen poised, uncertain how to begin this new chapter of his life. Finally, slowly, he began to write. April 28th, 1888. Today I married Sarah Tucker. Today 5 children became mine to protect and guide. Today we celebrated in a barn that 6 months ago was nothing but ash and promise. I came to this valley to collect a debt and found instead a family. I do not know if I deserve this second chance, but I intend to honor it with every breath I take. A vow in the valley, made not just to Sarah, but to Daniel, Sophie, Emma, Grace, and Ethan as well. I will be the man you deserve. I will build rather than destroy. I will love without condition or reservation. I will stay. This I swear, not as the man I was, but as the man I am becoming. Husband, father, builder of things that last. Mason closed the journal, a sense of profound rightness settling over him. Outside the window, stars scattered across the Arizona sky like diamonds on black velvet. The same stars that had guided him across countless wilderness trails now shone down on the home he had helped create. At last, after a lifetime of wandering, Mason Hawthorne was exactly where he belonged.